everybody, welcome back. I'm Taylor, and today we are going to be talking about AMC's new adaptation to Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and while you're at it, go ahead and hit that notification bell so you never miss a video here on Critical Commentary. I feel like it's so ironic that the first video I make coming back, I have this annoying allergy sinus thing. So I do apologize if I sound weird. I know it's been a minute since I did a video. I apologize. I know I'm always constantly apologizing for disappearing. It's just school and graduating and more school becoming just a huge part of my life. And so I do really appreciate those who still stick with me and are patient with me, because I really do love making these videos for you guys. And the minute I knew I was coming back and I was trying to think of like what I wanted to focus on, this series was the first thing that came to mind. Now, I haven't read Interview with a Vampire. I did get the book when I was like 13 because I had just seen Aaliyah's interpretation of Queen of the Damned, and I was just like so enamored by just how graceful and beautiful she was in that movie that I just like definitely felt like I needed to read the book. But Anne Rice has a very particular style of writing. I would even say it's very similar to Stephen King's in that they take a really long time to just like describe stuff. So a 13-year-old is not going to want to sit and listen to description for 4 or 5 pages. Whereas now that I'm older, I could see myself being a little bit more interested in reading the source material. So because I haven't read the book, I won't really focus too much of my review on that aspect of this series. I did see the original film with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt like a bunch of times growing up. So I'm gonna mostly like helm my review off of that versus the original source material. So I just wanted to let you guys know that because of that, it's gonna be a weird review because I feel like I can't really talk about the show without talking about the movie in a way that will still provide you with spoilers. So while this title probably says why you should be watching it, I will say that there are going to be spoilers for the movie. And I will maybe tie those into spoilers for the show, but I will try to keep the show spoilers to a minimum as much as possible, because as weird as it is, I feel like, there were a lot of changes that were done to the series, some of which I liked, some of which I had qualms with. I still think that regardless of its shortcomings, I'm really glad that vampires are just becoming more and more significant again. It's so amazing. I said this in my Midnight Mass video. I think that we're having a bit of a renaissance when it comes to vampire content. We've had like Vampire Academy come out. We've had Day Shift, which was a video that I did a roundtable with Nagasi and D Movie Man. So, and I'll try to link that video, so if you want to go see it, you can. But I am just a huge avid vampire freak, I guess. So I felt like this is the perfect like comeback video, is to talk about vampires. This new adaptation of Interview with a Vampire is both a soft reboot and a sequel. This series starts pretty much in 2022, and it kind of picks up where the movie ended, but with a time jump. So now we have Daniel, who was originally played by Christian Slater, is now being played by Eric Bogosian, who is now an aged and more skeptical reporter than from the original movie. He's gone through life, he has made mistakes, learned from those mistakes, and it's not until he receives tapes of the original interview, which is AKA the movie, that he is kind of rethrusted into this world of vampirism and all that it entails. I thought it was an interesting choice to start this series off in the middle of a pandemic. I've said this before, and I probably will not stop talking about it. There's a parallel between vampirism and sickness. And I brought this up, I believe, in my Midnight Mass video, where I discussed how a lot of the folkloric vampire, the rhetorical device of the vampire, is used to describe different types of illness. In this case, because we have just gone through a pandemic, it felt like that was like where they wanted to go. But I think that it gets a little bit more complicated as the story goes on. For one thing, Louis is now canonically black. I don't even know how else to say it. How else do you put, like, how do you say that without being, abrupt?
This can't be. It says I'm 102% African with a 2% margin of error. Why, Lord?
So yes, like I said before, obviously this is a reboot and they needed to recast, mostly because of some of the changes that they made to the original film. You remember that Louis Dupont du Lac was a slave owner, and so they decided to instead to add this diversity, and I think also to add more culture, like Creole culture, to the story. They, instead of having a Brad Pitt styled character, chose Jacob Anderson, who was a alum from Game of Thrones, who played Grey Worm. So I loved seeing him in this role. It was a definitely different role. It required him to be more emotional and more vulnerable, and I feel like he did a really good job conveying that. While I did not like the change in era, I'm trying to remember this movie, but I apologize if I get all my dates wrong. It's a piece of fiction. Don't sue me. But we start off in the mid 1800s, and in the series, we start kind of at the turn of the century. So you don't really get like the crinolines, the hoop skirts, the bustles, but I will say that there is a nod ish to that later on in the series. So while they made this diversity change, they adapted the story to go with it in a way that I think still kept the story alive. It would be hard to have a mixed Creole slave owner, but to be honest, I would have liked to seen that. That's one of the things that I did have a gripe about overall with the series, was that I would have liked to have seen this like very powerful and yet powerless person. But I think that because they wanted Louis to be this like likable character, they didn't want to have to paint him as a slave owner and all of that messiness. So I think that that's why they decided to change the period, which, I don't care. Costumes are still cute.
So fetch.
Lestat is now played by Sam Reed, who I feel like I've seen him in a bunch of things. Hold on. I know I've seen him in a bunch of things, and I just cannot for some reason place him. Oh my god, he's in Belle! He's in Belle. I cannot believe I did not notice that, because come on, that was my movie. Sam Reed from that movie is now playing the mantle of Lestat, which I think is a really hard character to portray, because he's very complex, and because Lestat is actually the real focus of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, like the whole trilogy, because he has his own book, and then he also is a main focus in The Queen of the Damned. I can see how this role was a little bit big in terms of shoes to fill. Stuart Townsend played Lestat in Queen of the Damned with this emo, dark, brooding nature, and Tom Cruise kind of played Lestat as this uptight snob. And I love how Sam Reed was able to almost marry the two, and because there are, updates to this story, I think that melding of the two makes him a better abusive figure, which, I won't really get into that too much. I will say that if you find intimate partner violence triggering, there is a part at the end of one of the episodes where you do see that. It is fictionalized because they are vampires, but at the same time, the essence of IPV is there. And I just want to let everybody know that because it's definitely used in the narrative. It's used as a way to kind of critique Louis and a lot of Louis's decisions. Not always in the best way. I don't think that's necessarily how you should handle survivors of IPV, but I think that like with the relationship and the history that is there between Louis and Daniel, it does make a little bit of sense because Daniel is now coming into this interview without rose-colored glasses. So a lot of where I said before this whole like reboot slash sequel comes into play is how the interview goes down. The catalyst of the interview is that Louis is like, I've reviewed this and I actually feel like this interview is not really indicative of the story that I want to tell. And so he brings Daniel to his home in Dubai because he wants to retell it, but with more authenticity. And I think because of the attack that Daniel experienced in the first film, he's like, hold on, I don't trust you. So his like way of speaking to Louis is a lot more aggressive than it was in the first or in the original film. I think in the original film, he's more like enamored by Louis. He finds Louis alluring. He wants what Louis has, eternal life. And so it's interesting to see how Daniel's perspective has changed since that time, and 20 years have passed. As far as the overall structure of both interviews, they're pretty much the same. The only difference is details and more character development, which I do think was a great decision. Because the story is more so set during Jim Crow versus during like the slave era, there are nuances that are brought up, but they're not done in a way that placates or patronizes anyone. It's definitely like talking about the realities of the South during this time. And I think that having this idea of like Louis being mixed and also being gay feeds into some of the like choices that he makes that lead up to him becoming a vampire. And I will say, I don't want to get too much into it, but one thing about him becoming a vampire was that he chose this in the show. I'm trying to remember how Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise did it, but I don't remember it being necessarily a consensual experience, at least not to the extent that Jacob Anderson and Sam Reed go through. Lestat is not so much this beautiful creature that just comes into Louis' life and changes it. He's more predatory. It's more methodical. And I also think that Louis being in the place that he's at is more vulnerable to that kind of abuser. And that's where I was going with before. This IPV is so kind of drawn out and it's used in a way that's extremely realistic. I feel like there are a lot of homoerotic tones in the movie, and I would be shocked to not see them in the original source material. But I think that where it's done differently is that, one, it's more explicit. Now we're not wondering if Lestat and Louis were partners. We know that they were. We see their life together as a couple. And I think that is best contextualized also with the relationship that they have to their pseudo stepdaughter, Claudia. Now, this is going to be where I have a bit of a controversial take. I was originally introduced to Interview with a Vampire through the original movie. So Kirsten Dunst was the Claudia that I grew up with. And while I like that they made Claudia of the same culture and background as Louis, mostly because I think they wanted to show their bond in a little bit more physical way, I did not really like how she was portrayed in this series. And I don't want to say that that's specifically because of how Bailey Bass plays her, But there was just this like level of subtlety in Kirsten Dunst's performance. I think because they made Claudia older for the series because of some of the stuff that she goes through, um, they lost a bit of that subtlety. It's a little bit easier to imagine her like pretending to be in her 20s, whereas like when you saw Kirsten Dunst, you knew she was a child. So her like maturity and her development became all the more tragic as they moved on throughout the centuries and decades together. Whereas now, because she's aged up, I feel like there's a bit of like a muddied um, like narrative around her. She chronicled a lot of their events together, and you see that in the show as well, like all of her diaries. And the diaries are supposed to be where you notice like the language change and the maturity there, but I think because of just how Bailey Bass played the like younger parts of the character, it kind of just took me out of the story. And again, I don't want to put that on her. I don't know if she has like a big filmography. I don't know if this is her first like big role, but it just felt like she was more of a verdant actor than what I think was maybe required for Claudia. Claudia's a very complex character. There's a lot there that isn't really said. And I think that they had to rely a lot on exposition that just shouldn't have been necessary. Overall, I would say that this show was, I mean, definitely solid. I'm curious to know what its like Rotten Tomatoes score was, just because I feel like not too many people have been discussing this show. And I know that Twitter's a whole dumpster fire. We won't get into that. But I want to know like what you guys think if you have seen the show, and if you have, please mark spoilers just so we don't like ruin it for anyone who hasn't or is like on the fence about watching it. I really did enjoy myself. I think that a lot of my critiques are just because, you know, when you love something so much, you kind of want to see it at its best. And I think a lot of my critiques are more of that than they are just me trying to hate on it for the sake of having something to talk about. I love the costumes. I think the acting was very good. And I think that the changes were done in a way that I could still see the echoes of the original film without feeling like I was tied or like held captive by them. And I really want to know what you guys think about that, because, you know, I think season 2 is supposed to be coming out either next year or the year after. I haven't really seen any full updates that I would quote to you a date. Did you like this show? Did you also have kind of similar opinions about the things that I was not really the, you know, most happy about? Were there things that I missed? Because, you know, I'm only one person and I'm not always going to pick up on things, so I would like to know your opinions in the comments. Also, make sure to follow me on Instagram, because I guess Twitter's dead, at CriticalCom with 2M's TV. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Bye, guys.